Thank you so much for being here, for everyone those who want to join online and for those who are here. Welcome to the second session of our this semester's conversation series. I'm very excited to have here Associate Professor Liezl van Zyl. And before we get started with this, to acknowledge that we are on the land of Aboriginal land, has always been, always will be, and of course with these thinking through these questions of land acknowledgement also reminds us like how much we have to think through in our everyday practices, not just knowledge practices, and the political practices, given the way the world functions right now. So on that note, so I'm very happy that we have a different kind of session format, but hopefully we'll have more time. So feel free to stay back even if we go a little bit ahead. So Kate would be the respondent for Liezl's after the talk. So it will be like 25 to 30 minutes. Feel free to take your time. No pressure there. So on to you.
Yeah, it's really nice to be here at your wonderful campus. I have a picture here of our lovely park at
Click on the
Waikato. But yeah, so I thought I'll start telling you about my initial thoughts on this topic, which I thought at the time were perfectly reasonable, but turned out to be a bit naive. Anyway, so here's the thoughts. It's like, is it what I don't want to be a burden on my children at the end of life. And it's probably it's an altruistic concern, it's like worry about them, but it's partly also, you know, it's a selfish concern, it's just don't want that for myself. The burdens here, if throughout, I mean mainly like burdens of caregiving or support, financial burdens, physical, like people having to carry you around, disruption, and so on. So what I seem to be doing in this sense is just weighing up the costs and the benefits for everyone involved, not just for me. And this seems like a morally responsible thing to do. It's like generosity and kindness don't stop being virtues at the end of life. Now, the next thought I had was that suicide is not a good option. Not for me. I'm probably going to botch it up. It's difficult. It's a horrible thing to do. It's not nice for your family. Someone has to find you. Well, assisted suicide, that seems to be a much better option. It's easier and many ways than it won't traumatize the family. Of course, New Zealand, and I think in New South Wales and possibly in Australia, I might not be able to get assisted suicide. You have to be suffering. And so my thought was, well, is this legal framework, is it forcing us to be selfish in ways? Like you only have to consider yourself and then your own suffering that matters. So shouldn't we then push for a system that's more like the one they have in Oregon and elsewhere in the States, where if you're terminally ill and you're consequent, you can get access to assisted dying. So in that system, the physician just prescribes the medication. They don't ask about your reasons for autism, but they do tick them off on a form. Data analysis purposes, and then you get your script and away you go, and then you can do it at home and have like a special death party, like a living funeral. You know, you can do whatever you like a designer death, and that seems cool. You know, choose the music and the guests and so on. Okay, so those are my initial thoughts. Then, well, put this into perspective, is the facts about burdensomeness at the end of life. Seems that, you know, I'm not the only one. Many people have this concern about being a burden on family. Families do provide most of the care at the end of life. The financial cost and the other costs are significant, and in many cases, And I think, well, that's clearly an undue burden. It's too much, like where families are having to give up a job, sacrifice, or give up a home, and so on. Interestingly, though, most people prefer to die at home, even though they don't want to be burdened. They prefer to die at home, and they realize that that increases the burden on family. Governments, of course, want the same because it's takes the pressure off hospitals. But now, so you're likely going to be a burden, but on the other hand, family members are not. They're going to do everything, well, typically do everything they can to avoid making you feel like a burden. Because that's part of the caregiving, is to is your psychological well-being. So they will happily make these sacrifices and probably lie to your face when you ask them, am I too much of a burden? They will say no. So there, there are examples in New Zealand, on New Zealand stuff where people would go without food so that they can buy their loved one a special food to tempt them into eating something, that kind of thing. And that seems unreasonable. Well, this seems too much. I mean, I wouldn't want that. Gotten also, the carers had a sense of urgency about meeting the person's needs, regardless of the cost. Okay, so takeaway is that family are going to make it very difficult for you to avoid being a burden. Now here's a very messy slide on what I call the autonomy model. This is how they do it in Oregon and some other states. And there it seems like the justification for assisted dying is the right to self-determination. People have a right to choose the manner and time of their death, that idea. For the physician, I think the reasons are trivial, but it's not up for them to judge the person's reasons. I mean, that's all part of being autonomous, is you get to decide what is a good reason yourself. So they only, as I said, give the prescription and then the patient would self-administer. One of the problems there, of course, is that once the patient can't self-administer, then they no longer they can no longer have assisted dying, but that's another question. A question for another time. This is just the. Do I go back? On the left here, that's just the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. So they do require 6 months terminal illness, but the 6 months, I think, is interpreted quite liberally. I mean, 6 months if you don't have any medical treatment. So that 6 months can well end up being quite a bit longer. On the right there, the table just shows the kinds of reasons that people give for choosing an BAD. So what's interesting there is that things like pain, suffering, discomfort, those kinds of things are not high on the list. Most of the time, things like wanting to have control over their death, not wanting to be dependent. And then a lot of those things are not to do with their current state either. It's to do with fear of the future suffering, the future discomfort. Not wanting to be a burden is quite high up there as a 4.5 out of 5. So if you look at it more closely, it seems a concern about being a burden is a factor, or that's in about half the cases. I haven't looked at it carefully enough, but there's something puzzling going on here, is that it seems that a patient, in principle, a patient whose only motive is to avoid being a burden could have access to BAD, but there's also some new data that shows that those requests are very unlikely to be honoured. So 3 out of 57 cases, what's the percentage? Whereas on the other hand, if the patients vote something like, I want to have control, you know, kind of do with self-determination and so on, then they're much more likely to get the prescription. So I'm wondering what's going on there. So it could be that in some cases the physician is just exercising their right to conscientious objection and look, I don't want to be involved in this. It could also be that they consider the expression of burdensomeness as indicative of a lack of capacity. So so then I looked into the literature on perceived burdensomeness. I have more on this in another version of this talk, but I thought you guys will be familiar with that literature. So it turns out there's these sort of two worlds, and maybe, you know, we're using the word burden in different ways, and maybe in some cases we're miscommunicating. So on the one hand, so if in psychology, psychiatry, palliative care, they have the notion of perceived burdensomeness, which is defined as a person feeling worthless, feeling that they would be better off dead. So that's a psychiatric symptom, I'd say, which would indicate that this person might not be capable of making a decision. It's just a symptom of all the psychological distress. So, so I think it's important that we distinguish that sense of burdensomeness from this other thing I thought I was talking about, is like just making a judgment that, well, actually, I think this would be too much of a burden on others. My judgment could be inaccurate. You know, someone might say, well, actually, the costs are not as much as you thought, and that might convince me otherwise. So it's a you know, it's the patient who says, look, I am a burden, I don't want to be a burden. In some cases, that it would be appropriate to have a discussion and say, well, let's talk this. There's a reason. Let's talk this through. So yes, I think we can't say that all cases of requesting assisted dying in order to avoid being a burden would be irrational or sign of incompetence. So I think probably a lot of people in Oregon are missing out on what they have a right to, because they're considered to be not autonomous. Okay, so now turning to some of the bioethical literature. So this is very old paper of John Hardwick, controversial. I think he made it, this is his life's work in the end. Like, this paper just like took off, and that was what he did for the rest of his life. Anyway, so he considers this question whether there's a duty to die, and he says yes, there's a duty to die. And then he uses this example of the 87-year-old woman who is lucid and so on, and she insists on the most aggressive life-prolonging treatment. It extends her life for another 2 years, and then it ruins her daughter's life. And that, you know, the daughter had to give up her career, income, and everything. You know, firstly, one wants to say, look, this is America. This is not going to happen here. But even the Australasian version of this kind of case could still be used to demonstrate that this is too much of a burden. So Hardwick says, well, you know, this shows that sacrificing your life is not always a greater burden than caring for a chronically ill family member. And he goes on to say, well, look, it's just that we have a duty to die in this kind of situation where continuing to live will impose too much of a burden on family. So in pink, this salmon pink, that my designer came up with this. Wasn't my thoughts. It's like, well, if we like opting for aggressive life prolonging treatment can be selfish and cowardly also, and imprudent, not in your best interest. And I think we should be able to criticize someone like that. It seems to me that people at the end of life go into this kind of zone where they're untouchable. No one can criticize them. Everything. Well, I think in this case, not knowing this woman, it's well, that was selfish. She should have considered how. She shouldn't have accepted this care. It sounds like the daughter was also paying for it, so that makes it even worse. So here, I mean, had she been concerned about the burden she imposes, that wouldn't have been irrational. But I mean, in Hardwick, it's just wrong to imply that this is a good example to use to show that you should sacrifice your life. You should choose death to avoid being a burden. Refusing life prolonging treatment is one thing. Committing suicide or having an assisted suicide is quite different. We can talk more about this, but I mean, I think what happened here is this. The influence by people like James Rachel with blurring the difference between active and passive euthanasia. Well, it's all the same. Hardwick seems to be saying like this is like a had she refused treatment, it would in effect be a passive suicide. And I think that's just wrong. I mean, that's not a passive suicide, it's just a refusal of treatment. And one can refuse treatment for all sorts of reasons, and even because you want to die. But it does show us that burdensome can be a reasonable concern. Anyway, so then let's turn to the other case that Hardwick discusses. This is not in a medical context. This is the famous case of Captain Oates, who went on the expedition to the South Pole. He had frostbite in his legs, and so they were in the tent at night, and he realized that the teammates will want to stay behind, and then everyone will die. So he just walked into a blizzard, and it seems that they realized that is what he was doing. So Scott apparently wrote in his diaries that they went out and they tried to stop him, but they also realized that he's not coming back. Anyway, so Hardwick says it would have been wrong for him to urge or even allow the rest to stay and care for him. I think that's correct. But then he said, well, there's no more than his duty. That is what he ought to have done, is to commit suicide. But I don't really agree with that. Well, the talk of duty in this context, especially, is just not. It doesn't work very well. Saying someone has a duty to die seems to imply that it would be wrong for them not to commit suicide. And further, I think as Michael Colby is arguing, that there's also implied that, well, were he not to commit suicide, then others will have a right to kill him. Well, and again, what Colby means, the right to kill him can also can be exercised by just leaving him behind. And again, I'm thinking, well, leaving him behind is not killing him. That's just not, Anyway, so in my view, I think that this is it's a suicide. You can describe it as an act of courage. Like, the courage is involves overcoming the fear, in this case, the fear of death, or fear of a lonely death, or fear of dying in a blizzard, whatever. And he did this for the sake of a noble end. But if you think more carefully about what this noble end is, like what did he achieve? Like what is it that he wanted to do? It's not saving their lives. It's not as if that would that action is an act of saving them, that or even of giving them a chance to survive, because they could have just left him behind. Like and they would have had every right to do that. So I think what happened there is he realized they would feel obliged to stay with him. They might not actually stay with him, but will find it incredibly difficult to leave him behind. So they were in a kind of a moral dilemma. The correct solution to that dilemma would have been to carry on. So he kind of, by committing suicide, he relieved them of that moral burden. Just making it easier for them to do what they had to do. So that's why I think it's an act of courage, but it's also a generous act. He did more than what was required by justice. So this kind of case actually, in this sense, seems to me could be similar to the person who says, well, look, I know my family is going to want to take care of me. Even if I refuse, if I tell them not to, they're still going to want to do it. They're going to be, and even if they then end up not taking care of me, they're going to feel terrible about it. So they're going to be in that kind of difficult situation. And this is what I'm relieving them of. So, okay, so then we get to the question. So if a patient asks for VAD to relieve others of the burden, of this moral burden or the burden of caring for them, shouldn't we also say that this is an act of courage and generosity? So, well, thought about it a bit. Well, actually, the obvious difference between suicide and assisted suicide is that assisted suicide requires assistance. Like, I feel sort of awkward making a very obvious point, but I think it's a point that's lost in the rhetoric around assisted dying. This my body, my rights, my life, that kind of stuff, like I have a right to die in whichever way I want to. So it's not all about you. The question is not just, well, would it be generous for me to sacrifice my life for others, but rather, is it fair to ask someone else, like a medical practitioner, to help me make this sacrifice? I think not. I'd like to hear your views on that. I like this little story from, this is from the Netherlands, of a doctor who says, in the coldest weeks of last winter, a doctor friend of mine was told by an elderly patient, I demand to have euthanasia this week. You've promised. And the doctor replied, it's minus 15 degrees outside. Take a bottle of whiskey and sit in your garden and we will find you tomorrow, because I cannot accept that you make me responsible for your own suicide. So I think, yeah, that's the point that us patients tend to forget, is that you are actually imposing on others the burden of helping you form this generous act. Okay, so I think, well, from a medical perspective, is that the medical practitioner, because say that assisted dying in this kind of situation is just not compatible, consistent with the aims of medicine. So we've already pushed the aims of medicine and accepted that prolonging life or aggressively doing everything we can to prolong life is not always beneficial. I think that people like, there's still a lot of disagreement on this, but I think it would be consistent with the goals of medicine to administer assisted dying in a case where that's really the only way to end this person's suffering, because you're still benefiting that patient. But ending a patient's life to benefit others, that seems to me a step too far. And I think one could say probably the same, many kind of the cases that are happening in Oregon where the patient's motive is not to relieve suffering right now or even in future. It's just, I want to do it my way. I have this plan for a death party. Now, I mean, that seems nice if you want to do that, but do we want to involve the medical profession in that? So, I mean, if that's the kind of thing we want, we have a right to die in whichever way we want, then we should set up some kind of a non-medical system of assisted dying. And then there are all these interesting ideas with suicide pods and stuff like that, where the only requirement is that you're competent and you have capacity, but keep the medical profession out of it. Yeah, and this is probably the last. So just to end off, I think there are cases where burdensomeness, or given burdensomeness as a reason for requesting assisted dying is consistent. Does not involve sacrificing yourself. Where there's a kind of a harmony, or where it's in the interest of both the patient and the family. So this is a case. So the patient was says there's no question about wanting to make provisions for a hastened death should conditions become so unbearable. So she's thinking of a future time. I want to spare my family as much of that grief as I can. And then she thinks back. My mother died of cancer, and we were constantly frustrated by not being able to do anything for her, and just watched her waste away. And what a terrible way to go! So she's kind of wanting to protect her family from her own suffering. And that seems to be entirely reasonable. Of course, in the New Zealand Australasian context, she would have to wait for the suffering to become unbearable before she can make that application. And so maybe that's one thing we should think about changing. Is like, I was telling my husband this the other day, and he said, this is not a good example. But anyway, I'm going to go with it. It's like, if you're giving birth, like, you have the drugs ready in case things get, you don't wait until the pain becomes unbearable before you ask about and make decisions about whether to use something for the pain. Anyway, so maybe one can say something similar in palliative care is getting the application going, and in case you should need it later on. Another kind of case that seems to kind of a harmony between the interest of the patient and the family is this woman. She's had rheumatoid arthritis all her life. So she says, I know that pain, I can handle that pain, but this pain that comes with the cancer she has now, says, I can't get rid of the pain medicine always. To give me enough to keep my pain under control, they'd have to put me out. And I don't want my son to have to take care of a bed patient. So that some people in palliative care say, well, there's never a situation where we can't manage your pain. If it can't be relieved, then you can opt for terminal sedation. And so, well, sure, then I no longer suffer, but now others around me suffer. In any case, what's the point of that? So I'd be inclined to think that assisted dying in that kind of case could be both prudent in your own self-interest and considerate of others. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. Okay, so concluding thoughts, to come back to my initial thoughts is like, okay, if I'm serious about not wanting to be a burden on my family, then there's some things I can do, like declining treatment, having an advance directive, not insisting on buying a car, that'll depend on the circumstances, getting my affairs in order, and communicating clear, sincere, honest communication with family. But assisted dying, probably not on the table. Okay. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Kate.
Sure. So I was, we decided I would give a very brief response and like lob the first question and then we'll open it to the floor. So I will keep my response pretty brief. I think this is a really interesting way of thinking through the problem of assisted dying, where it always seems like we're trying to find the balance, morally speaking, between the patient as an agent and the patient as a victim. Speaking from the Canadian context with medical assistance in dying, that was a big part of the debates that we're having in Canada into the lead up, was how do we make sure that this isn't a coerced choice, because the family puts pressure on people who may not even be terminally ill, but may be suffering from disability, or because they were looking to the Netherlands, there have been a couple of cases of mental illness, like intractable depression, that have been granted. So the question was really like, how do we make sure that this is a choice and not coercion? But the question of burdensomeness, and especially the cases at the end that you presented, really highlight how a person's experience of seeing a loved one go through a prolonged death can not only cause intense suffering for the person who's helping the other through death, but really make them think about how they want to die and probably not be that same source of burden in this case. When we watch a loved one suffer, we suffer. So there's, I guess this is a part of what you were trying to get to with the kinds of costs of various kinds about burdensomeness, not the pathological feeling of burdensomeness, but the more sort of rational feeling of burdensomeness is like, well, based on what I've been diagnosed with and maybe what I've experienced or what I've even seen a friend experience or something like that, I know that I'm not going to be the only one suffering as I go through this. I will suffer, but so will anyone who loves me as they watch my state kind of deteriorate. And that's really morally weighty, I think. It's interesting to think about the angle of the caregiving and how caregivers have this extra emotional burden of trying to downplay that burdensomeness and how much they're suffering for the other person. To what you said, even lying to their loved one about how much of burden their loved one is. And I think that this makes it complicated in the first chart that you showed. I noticed that it was the family members' views on reasons. instead of a self-report. The second one looked like a self-report, but the first one was the family members' views. And they may well be underreported where burdensomeness goes on that list. Because either it's unexpressed by their family members, or the burdensomeness is a part of the other factors that their family member has explained to them. Like perhaps part of the fear of a loss of independence is burdensomeness, in fact. But they've clearly separated that out for the chart, but the family member themselves might have wrapped those in together. So I guess I want to sort of end on a question of the aims of medicine, but I'll say something first about the kind of courageousness and compassion of assisted dying, of accessing assisted dying. It's interesting to think through how sacrifice of that kind, because I do actually think that it is a sacrifice, is compassionate for others or is courageous. And I think when it's connected to let's say accurate sense of how much suffering your own suffering might impose, then I can imagine how we could sort of activate the virtue of compassion there and say, your motive is to avoid the suffering of others that you accurately believe you will cause. The tricky part about that is that it comes down very much to the details, like what are the options for palliation? Some people actually who've studied in the Master of Bioethics have convinced me, oh, hi Sally, speaking of you, that having really good palliation would obviate a lot of the fears. And if you knew that you lived in a system where there was really good and accessible palliation, you might not be so afraid of the pain. And you might not, in fact, you might not cause so much suffering on the other. So that becomes a tricky one, because you have to have a very accurate sense of the context in order for your action to be virtuous. So that would be quite dependent. And the final question, I think, is really interesting to think about the aims of medicine. Like, what are the proper aims of medicine? That's I don't know, I would love to hear what you actually think the aims of medicine are. Because I mean, for my part, I think it's not the Hippocratic Oath. It's not honor the gods and honor your profession and do no harm, but something more like help to heal, help achieve healing, which is very, very different also from cure. So rather than thinking that the aim of medicine is somehow curative or something like this, rather the aim of medicine is like way more variable in terms of healing and helping people heal, which in a terminal case, healing clearly doesn't mean cure. It clearly doesn't mean like not having this illness anymore. It means something else. And part of that healing could be achieving a good death in a weird way. So I don't know. I'm interested to know what the aims of medicine are. So that's my first question to you. And then we can open the floor.
Oh gosh. And now I'm going over some of your earlier questions in the meantime. But so I mean that's a really difficult question. So I have a kind of a sense of what it cannot be. So the kind of consumer model where like the medicine is just to like give people what they want. I mean, we have examples of something like plastic surgery. That would you include that as part of medicine, or is that kind of a different thing? I mean, certainly you want it to be broader than just to do with medical benefits. So I think that's what you have in mind when you think of healing as a more where people use a sort of a holistic approach. I'm nervous about this kind of holistic approach because I think they, medical professionals are overstepping their roles. Like, I'm expecting a medical professional to tell me, what are my medical options and how would this look, and then I can make the decision based on all the other considerations I have as well. So, I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely nothing like prolonging or clearing. I mean, certainly that would be great if that can be done, but that easing suffering.
Coaching, and then James, feel free to just raise your hands or just show me the signs.
Thank you. My question is about the account of virtue ethics underwriting your argument. So is it like a eudaimonistic virtue ethics? Because if it is, then maybe coming back to your question, maybe the aim of medicine should be flourishing, and then we should accommodate those expressions of burdensome to the extent that they are facilitating flourishing at the end of life. I thought that maybe that could be an extension of the argument if we have that eudaimonistic account of virtue ethics. But the basic question is what particular account is that playing?
So I am already committed to eudaimonistic account of virtue ethics. So in the sense that the virtues are those traits that allow us to flourish. So if you think of the role of medicine within that context, I don't think the role of medicine can be described as enabling us to flourish. That's too much. Like that's too broad. You need to be more specific, as to do with physical, mental health and well-being. And the context of dying, I think and I think more and more people are writing about the idea of dying well, what it is to achieve a good death. Some of that would be the domain of medicine. It's like managing pain, explain to patients what they could expect, managing their fears about future discomfort. So that was something I thought about. Your point is that people who've seen a parent die a miserable death and is afraid of that, things have changed, and hopefully since then for many people is that to explain to them that if it's not palliative care has approved, you're not needing to go through that. And that's one worry with the autonomy system is that the issue is just what is it that they want, and they might not, the person might not have been informed of all of their options already. So and that's the problem is that the end of the justification is to respect people's rights and not to their well-being or yes, in that sense I think maybe medicine can't be not be a paternalistic system. Like there is a kind of like we know better and we can tell you and explain to you and inform you and so on and guide you through it. But the idea that the patient is autonomous, I find it interesting that there's the critique of the autonomy model itself is that patients don't have enough autonomy. It's like I would have gone the other way, but I said, well, there's not, you think this is autonomy? No, it's not autonomy. You have to go to the doctor. You need to get a diagnosis. You need to go through the hoops, and then they need to give you a script, and that's not autonomous. And being autonomous looks quite different. And but yeah. That's the problem with the autonomy becomes the highest the goal.
Can I make a little? I'm going to make a little finger note on that. Aristotle actually thought that medicine was a technique, and not so it's a kind of skill, but it's like shoemaking. It's not, and lawyers were like shoemakers too. So people who do that are like craftspeople. Rather than it actually contributing to the virtues. So I think exactly like what you were saying, it could provide the conditions that you might otherwise need, like you need shoes, and you need a physician. But certainly for him, I mean, being a physician was a very different thing at the time.
Yeah.
So health, well-being is an external good.
Yeah.
That's needed for flourishing, and the role of medicine to provide that good.
That's great. We'll take one. Jackie?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really, really interesting, fascinating, and obviously prompted a lot of questions. And I'm not going to go anywhere near goals of medicine. I didn't mind a much less ambitious question or reflection. I hope it's not a comment disguised as a question or the other way around. What is so wrong with being a burden? I mean, it sort of started from the premise there that being a burden is necessarily a wrong thing, but everyone is a burden on everyone else. So there's some phrasing there about undue burden. So then you have to ask the question, who gets to decide where you tip over from being a okayish burden to being an undue burden? And then you start to have to think about all the ways in which a decision made by a person about I am an undue burden is not necessarily a rational one, because we know it's a very the expectations of whether one is a burden or not is a very gendered thing. It's a very ableist thing. It's affected by a lot of other frameworks around that. So whether you can ever say that an individual decision about, I'm an undue burden now, is a rational one, I think is really problematic. And I guess the other comment I wanted to make was that one can think in terms of a person deciding rationally, I'm relieving my family of the burden of having to look after me and perhaps suffering through seeing me suffer with a horrible terminal illness or something like that. But then you could also argue that by doing that, they may well, in many cases, be inflicting the burden of persistent guilt on the rest of their family, which, for the rest of that family's life, which they're now well out of that suffering because they're dead. And so they have no longer any responsibility for what the family, their children, their relatives, or whatever, the medical profession may be going through because of the decision that they nobly took to remove themselves. So I think what I'm doing is sort of adding complexities to the reflection rather than challenging anything that you've said.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. So, when I say want to be a burden, well, definitely don't mean I want to be abandoned. It's like, you guys are going to take care of me. But yeah, it's the undue burden that is what I want to avoid, so that too much of a burden, and that becomes a difficult calculation. But yes, so then I think that you're right. You also have to keep in mind, well, if I insist on this generous act and burdening people of my care, then I might well burden them with a guilt and that would make it worse in the long term. So, but yeah, it's also interesting that you know, caregivers seem willingly and happily to provide that care. They probably need more support, if anything. You know, if it's too much, it's not the fault of the patient, but it's the fault of the system. They need more support. But it is interesting that many of them then say, well, but I wouldn't want the same for me. I wouldn't want other people to do the same for me. Now, and that seems to be more to do with, you know, you want to be the agent, you don't want to be the patient. It's like, it's nice to be, you know, the one giving the care, but accepting, and maybe that is a problem, is that we need to address is that it's okay to be a person or to accept care and to be vulnerable, like
Sure, I think it's still interesting. I'm very new to virtue, so this might be really conceptual and not particularly practical. Sorry. But it sort of carries on from what everyone's saying with the Jackie's question about burden and persistent guilt, but also the role of the physician. I think it's got two parts. So first of all, it sounds like there's this idea of taking the burden off the family and putting it onto the doctor, almost as in, if I
and what kind of situation you mean?
if somebody is seeking voluntary assisted dying, so you know, wanting to say, I don't want my family to have the burden of taking care of me, but as you were saying, this is a burden that instead of asking the doctor to carry. I'm wondering if you or anyone have thoughts about whether a doctor has a duty to be able to carry more of a burden than your average person. And the second part,
can we take one at a time?
yes, absolutely.
So certainly physicians carry heavy burdens more so than any other people. That specific one seems to be too much to ask. And I mean, I don't think patients would even think about this as it's like, he's just doing his job, you know, I've got a right to this, like, and not, you know, at the end of the day, physicians are people, and there's studies on the effect that participating in advanced and this is the dying has on physicians, and how many of them what they in favour of the practice or legalizing it, but don't want to get involved, or you know, don't want to get involved all the way, and that does. I think what you know why it is burdensome, especially burdensome, is because exactly they are in the business of well, not killing people. Like that's usually the worst thing you can do is, you know, lose a patient. So yes, I mean, I think we can ask a lot of them, but not that. I think that seems much. Because it doesn't have to do anything to do with your own suffering or well-being. It's just something you like to have.
And again, this might be way too conceptual and out there, but if we're, say, undergoing voluntary assisted dying to spare the suffering of our children and so on, is that actually denying them an opportunity to develop the, like, you know, extreme virtues that one could develop going through that? Is that a thing?
Yes, I mean that is definitely something one should think about. Is like, well, it would be a mistake if we reach the point where we say, well, look, I've got 6 months left, so let's end it now. What's the point of going through this? Is you know, from my own experience, the last 6 months of someone's life was often the most valuable. Every day was very precious, and yes, there was suffering and it was hardship, but it was something we needed to go through. And say, wouldn't want to package as or sell it as a, this is a chance for you to develop some virtue. That seems an odd way to go about it, but that's part of life. Is we have to go through the difficult times, and people who are dying can be incredibly generous and role models, of courage and dignity and going through that process. But it can also be really, really nasty, and so in those cases, so it's about making that very, very difficult judgment. Is about is this going to be traumatizing and incredibly disruptive for caregivers, or is it manageable?
I was just thinking, I'll come to you, Sally, just a question I had. Is burdensome, I mean, I'm wondering from the thought of affective experience, or how burdensome you feel towards someone or yourself, like how you are creating one. But what is the relationship between the state or the structural, which is abandoned, like system, for example, when no one cares about you? Because there's one of the scale which I saw is like fear of not taking care of oneself. So then the question for me is that related to the feeling which one feels that in relation to a family, or is it because the state has abandoned you, or the system or the society has abandoned you, and so now you feel burdened towards it? So do you feel the relationship beyond this, the family or a physician, but beyond the structural, the idea of burdensome?
So I'm not sure I get the question. Is it that you're thinking of someone who doesn't have any family support? And
yeah, it's like here one of the scale which I saw, I'm not sure whether the scale, the whole list which you showed, there was one of the scale was pretty high, was fear of not taking care of oneself. So then the question is, it's not just a family, or it's just not about the individual, but it's the society where one feels that you're not taken care of.
I'm not sure what they mean by that. So that longer graph. So that was a study where they asked family members afterwards, why do you think, what motivated them? And those are things that they came up with. Unfortunately, they often don't clearly define what it is they're talking about, or it doesn't, that makes it very difficult to interpret. Yeah, the other graph, to come back to your point, is where they list the patient's reasons. So that's just, as I understand, from a form that the physician has, where he just ticks off, and so one of those is feel like a burden, but then they don't define, at least it doesn't define, what do I mean by it, that feel like a burden. But it's not something they take a lot of care of. It's just a tick box, because it doesn't really matter as long as the patient is. So I think they just do that for statistical purposes, but it's not very, very helpful at all, because we don't know what it means. It could well be used for some depression, or it could be feeling of who's going to take care of me? No one's going to take care of me.
Thanks. Sally?
Oh gosh, I'm just madly typing because I've got to go to a critical meeting at 1 o'clock. But this is Sally Greenaway. I'm a hematologist and a palliative care physician, as well as working in clinical ethics. So I've thought so much about this, and I found the conversation, the presentation very, very rich. I was just going to make the point that I think one thing that we need to remember is the construction of burdens is very much not an individualistic thing. It's created by a society that values the individual for their economic production rather than they being of worth themselves. And for so many people, burdensome is a construct imposed by an unjust society. And I think, for many people, they're faced with not just the right to die because of the existence of these laws, but whether they now have a duty to die because of the profound economic destruction of their family that will be produced. And I see this writ large all the time. I work in Western Sydney, which is highly multicultural. The other thing, this is, of course, a very focused cultural choice. And I think it's very much for those that it's an end-of-life care pathway that I feel is of great value to a small proportion of the population, but it doesn't take into account, as the Lancet Commission into the value of death noted, that death is so often a gift. And if we support people to care for people they love, it's a life-changing, deeply rich and valuable experience. But, we're not wrapping people up with care structures that enable them to have value, coherent, goal-aligned care. It's a very narrow pathway. So yes, I'm just adding nuance and complexity, but I think all of these things are very relevant to the consideration of who creates the burdensomeness and what are the value systems that allow these people to think of themselves as burdens, or for them, that the people who are caring for them to be punished in this way. But thank you so much. It's a great presentation.
Thank you so much.
I've got to go, and I do apologise.
I think we are all almost done.
I'll run away now, having thrown a few stones. And Kate, lovely to see you.
So,
Bye, everyone.
well, thank you so much for everyone. I guess we are out of time, so we'll just wrap up this. Thank you so much again, Liezl, and then of course, thank you so much, Kate. Pleasure. For you all for the next conversation.